So the last lecture covered a call for unity, and this lecture is going to cover King's response to the clergy's call for unity, his letter from a Birmingham jail. Now, this is one of the most famous pieces of literature in American history, right? So it's a big deal, this text, right? It's impossible to go through 4 years of college without reading this at some point, right? Either in an ethics class or an American literature class or even a political science class. Now, one of the first arguments that King rejects is the outside agitator argument. And what again does the clergy say about outside agitators, right? The argument is that King doesn't have any legitimate reason to be in Birmingham, right? He doesn't have any legitimacy to organize and to agitate and to protest in Birmingham because he's not local, right? He's not from there, and this is a local issue, the clergy say. They write, "We are now confronted by a series of demonstrations by some of our Negro citizens that are directed and led in part by outsiders. But we are convinced that these demonstrations are unwise and untimely. We agree rather with certain local Negro leadership, and we believe this kind of facing of issues can best be accomplished by citizens of our own metropolitan area, white and Negro, meeting with their knowledge and experience of the local situation," right? By implication, King doesn't have, right, that kind of localized knowledge about Birmingham and how to address the racial friction in the city, again, because he's not from there. So what do you think, right? Is this a good argument, the outside agitator argument that we kind of continue to hear even today whenever there's unrest in cities, right? Think about BLM, think about George Floyd protests, police chiefs, city mayors, the media too, generally tell us that a lot of the people who are getting arrested are, quote unquote, outside agitators who don't have any legitimate reason to be in those cities in the first place. And what are King's arguments to the outside agitator trope? Well, King's first response is to simply note that, look, I'm here because I was invited here, right? I've got a sister organization in Birmingham, and they asked me to come. And so that's why I'm here. That hardly makes me an outsider. Now, the second response that King has to the outside agitator criticism is a much more philosophically kind of nuanced argument. He says, but more basically, I'm in Birmingham because injustice is here. I'm cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow, provincial, quote, outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds. And so the idea here is that when people are suffering the same forms of oppression everywhere, doesn't it make sense for us to come to each other's assistance, right? To make common cause with our brothers and sisters, right? In other words, this isn't outside agitation, it's solidarity. King says, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, right? Tied in a single garment of destiny. I think part of King's counter-argument here emphasizes the idea that our lives are never merely our own. Rather, your existence is inescapably implicated in the lives of others, right? The people who grow the food you eat, the people who made the clothes you wear, the people who built the roads you drive on to get to the grocery store, to get to school, to get to work, the people who maintain the basic infrastructure of the economy, right? The teachers who taught you how to read, the family and relatives who loved you into being, right? You might Look at yourself, King says, and think that you're kind of a self-sufficient, rugged individual lifting themselves up by their bootstraps. But the truth is, you have already benefited more from the labor of others than you will ever be able to contribute yourself. And the same goes for everyone else alive in a society, right? We're in this together, and there is no I independent of the communities that precede us and from which we come. And so a deeper implication then of King's argument and his counter-argument against the outside agitator idea is that as long as we understand the problems we face individualistically, we're going to be powerless against those problems, right? It often takes a social movement, collective social struggle, to dismantle those systems that affect entire groups. And the Jim Crow South is one such system. Now, King said, I'm in Birmingham because there is injustice in Birmingham. So let's think a little bit about the city of Birmingham in the 1960s. Just for one, this was one of the most segregated cities in the country at the time. Here are a few of King's own descriptions of Birmingham from his autobiography. He says, in Birmingham, brutality against Negroes was an unquestioned and unchallenged reality. Local racists intimidated, mobbed, and even killed Negroes with impunity. One of the more vivid examples of the terror of Birmingham was the castration of a Negro man whose mutilated body had then been abandoned on a lonely road. No Negro home was protected from bombings and burnings. And between 1947 and 1965, there were over 50 bombings of black churches and homes. There were so many bombings of black activists and just black folks that Birmingham received the nickname Bombingham, right? So this is the city that we're dealing with here, that we're going to go and protest in, right? But it was precisely because Birmingham was such a bastion of racial subjugation and racial terror that King's organization chose to campaign there. King writes, we believed that a campaign in Birmingham could surely be the toughest fight of our civil rights careers, but it could, if successful, break the back of segregation all over the nation, right? A victory there might well set forces in motion to change the entire course of the drive for freedom and justice. In other words, Birmingham was strategically precious territory for the social struggle against racism and white supremacy in the South. And also a very, very dangerous place to go and protest and demonstrate and agitate, even if you're doing it, of course, non-violently. Now, victory in Birmingham would mean successfully facing off against the Birmingham Police Department. And this meant facing off against the notorious racist Bull Connor. He was the Commissioner of Public Safety in Birmingham and pretty much had kind of complete control over the city. Now, Bull Connor was sort of an international symbol of racism and police brutality. Here are a few quotes from Bull Connor, right? If the North keeps trying to cram this thing, meaning desegregation, down our throats, there's going to be bloodshed. He also said, all you got to do is tell them, the protesters, right, black folks, that you're going to bring in the dogs. Look at them run. I want to see the dogs work, right? Just celebrating the use of barbaric violence on black folks in Birmingham. And, further he says, ain't gonna desegregate no N-word and whites together in this town, right? So this is the kind of captain of the police department. He's also in control of the fire department in Birmingham, right? So it's against this vile, racist Bull Connor that the Birmingham campaign protesters are going to employ their strategy of nonviolent civil disobedience. So what do you think? Is the violence and brutality of Bull Connor going to be a good thing or a bad thing for the Birmingham campaign and its nonviolent demonstrators? Well, that's a bit of a tricky question, right? It kind of depends on your perspective. But in order to think through this, right, we have to recognize, and this is what is often overlooked, is that nonviolence isn't merely a moral or a philosophical choice to be peaceful when protesting, right? Rather, it's one particular tactic among other tactics, right? So it's not just a set of value judgments, it's a set of strategic judgments about how to engage in disobedience and social struggle against the state, right? So for King, nonviolence is both a philosophical, moral position, but also a strategic position. And so in terms of nonviolence being a strategy, for King, he believes that even if violence is morally justifiable, right, he believes that the use of violence in protest has certain strategic limitations that nonviolence can actually successfully overcome. All right, so how does this strategy, how does the tactic of nonviolence supposed to work? Well, in order to be tactically successful, nonviolent protesters have to lure out the violence of the police, the violence of the state, and then display that violence before the conscience of the country, right? So this is one of the basic paradoxes of nonviolence that popular discourse kind of leaves out. In order for nonviolence to be successful, it has to produce violence, right? It has to produce, lure out, right, the violence of the state, and then put it on display for everyone to see, right? This is what popular culture forgets. Nonviolence during the civil rights movement was successful only insofar as it could exhibit before the entire country the racist horror of segregation and the brutal lengths that the police would go to maintain that racial horror, right? As King says, we would present our very bodies as a means of laying our case before the conscience of the local and the national community. We would present our very bodies and let ourselves be attacked to lay our case before the conscience of the country. Right? King continues. This is all from the letter that we read, right? He says, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has consistently refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. Okay, so for King and practitioners of nonviolence, the strategy requires a commitment to non-retaliation, right? And this is absolutely necessary to understand when we're thinking through the philosophy of nonviolence as a particular strategy and tactic among other strategies and tactics, right? The tactic of nonviolence doesn't just mean, oh, we're going to be peaceful and not throw bricks at windows or at cops, right? A commitment to nonviolence means primarily we will not engage in self-defense, even if engaging in self-defense is morally justified, right? When white mobs and the police attack us, we will not fight back, right? So, again, as King kind of describes this, he says, we began a series of workshops on nonviolence, and we repeatedly asked ourselves, are you able to accept blows without retaliating? Blows from the police, blows from white mobs. And so strategic nonviolence, then, it not only attempts to lay claim to the moral high ground, but it attempts to inject into everyone's lived reality a profound crisis, right? This creative tension, as King calls it. The creative tension that emerges when you're seeing nonviolent protesters being brutalized, right? The creative tension is meant to force the moderates and everyone else on the sidelines to confront the issue of racism that they've kind of been ignoring, right? Now it makes it impossible to ignore. it confronts you, or it forces you to confront the situation and to choose a side, right? Do you side with freedom, liberation, desegregation, or do you side with the status quo, which is segregation, and do you side with the brutality of those who maintain it, right? If you're not on the side of the protesters, well, it's like you're on the side of the status quo and those who maintain the status quo by unleashing barbaric violence onto the protesters, right? To try and not choose, right, is to implicitly support by default the continuity of the status quo and the violence that's used to maintain it. But what all of this means then is if the police aren't barbaric and aren't violent, if they treat the protesters humanely, then the strategic purpose of nonviolence sort of fails, right? If you can't lure out the violence of the state and put on display in front of everyone innocent, peaceful protesters being brutalized, well, then you kind of lose this creative tension that nonviolence seeks to create in the hearts and minds of all the bystanders and in the conscience of Americans who are watching from their television screens. So in Albany, Georgia, right, about 8 months before the Birmingham campaign, this is exactly what happened, right? Nonviolence failed to kind of dramatize the horror of segregation because the Albany police relied on a strategic refusal to brutalize protesters on camera, right? The police used, as King says, the moral means of nonviolence to preserve the white supremacist violence of Jim Crow racial subjugation. And we'll talk more about this in the next kind of lecture, an analysis of the police chief in Albany, Laurie Pritchett, and how he was very strategic and shrewd, and how he neutralized the protests by being very, very nonviolent with his police precinct and his police troops and the riot police. Now, most of Birmingham, right, during the Birmingham campaign, they had no intention of, presenting their bodies to the state and the police to be brutalized, right, in nonviolent resistance. And so throughout downtown Birmingham, during the campaign, there were just hundreds of onlookers who refused to join in with King's nonviolent protests. Right? For most people, nonviolence just did not appear to be a very reasonable path to liberation. Right? This is why the ethical and strategic value of nonviolence was very much debated throughout the civil rights movement. Right? We kind of have erased this fact. We think that everyone was just sort of on board with nonviolence. No, civil rights leaders, Black freedom struggle philosophers and thinkers were debating this topic of nonviolence, right? Of not retaliating, of presenting your body to be beaten by the police and the state in order to claim the moral high ground. It just wasn't at all obvious that this was the most effective or even a justifiable strategy to fight for social justice. Maybe a few final points here is another important point about the Birmingham campaign, or rather just about Birmingham, was that the city wasn't just full of white bigots, right? The city had plenty of, white kind of moderates who were on board really with desegregation. They detested the way that Black folks were treated by the laws and by those who enforced the laws, right? The Birmingham police. But all of these white moderates, they were used to keeping quiet, right? They didn't want to be agitators. They didn't really want to choose a side. They were well adjusted to injustice, even though they didn't like the way Black folks were treated. And so as Martin Luther King writes in his autobiography when he's reflecting on the Birmingham campaign, he says, certainly Birmingham had its white moderates who disapproved of Bull Connor's tactics. Certainly Birmingham had its decent white citizens who privately deplored the maltreatment of Negroes. But they remained publicly silent. It was a silence born of fear of social, political, and economic reprisals. The ultimate tragedy of Birmingham was not the brutality of the bad people, but the silence of the good people. And a common assumption is that the politically moderate position, right, between the two extremes is likely to be the correct or the reasonable or the more virtuous position. But matters aren't always so simple, and I think this is one of many reasons why King's letter from Birmingham jail is still so important, is that it really deconstructs and undermines that very simple narrative that says, oh, you want to find the correct, the virtuous position, it's going to be the middle ground between the two kind of extremes. And in his critique of the white moderates, he kind of very clearly shows that this isn't quite the case. When it comes to the white moderates, right, King says, this was on page 10 of Letter from Birmingham Jail, I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. Right, so what's going on here? What does King mean that the white moderate is a greater stumbling block than the KKK? And this will be the final point. The white moderate is essentially saying racial progress is okay, but there has to be patience and good manners. There has to be a respect for law and order. In other words, yeah, racial progress can proceed so long as it proceeds at a pace that is dictated by the comfort of the white majority. And this is a big problem, as King rightly points out. It exhibits an unwillingness to challenge the status quo in a manner that might actually be effective. And he'll lay out further kind of critiques of the white moderate, and that's what we'll pick up on in the next lecture video. Thanks.